In the world of extreme mountaineering, where the lines between triumph and tragedy is often too thin, one expedition sent shockwaves through the global climbing community. In July 2013, against the majestic peaks, Marty and Denali Schmidt started a journey that would test their courage and resilience to unimaginable limits. The 53 and 25-year-old father and son from New Zealand bid goodbyes to their loved ones as they began their ascent towards K2. Little did anyone know that this venture would mark the heartbreaking end of their remarkable story. This clip dives into the chilling details of the ill-fated 2013 K2 incident, unraveling the reasons for the tragic outcome. As far as mountaineers are concerned, Marty Schmidt was a legend. He was the first person to reach each of the 7 summits. Schmidt also made history by being the first New Zealander to reach the peak of Makalu without supplemental oxygen. The mountaineers he guided up, some of the world's most dangerous peaks, regarded him as an exceptional guide as well. On the other hand, Denali Schmidt was on course to follow his successful father's footsteps. Denali came from an adventurous background and naturally took an interest in climbing mountains. His parents and siblings climbed soon after birth in New Zealand, the United States, Italy, Switzerland, and France. He too quickly established himself as a full-time mountaineer. The father and son made quite a team together, embarking on daring expeditions and accomplishing feats never attempted. Even more impressive, they mapped out a new path up Denali called the Dad and Son route. Their lives were a reflection of their dedication to the hobby and always garnered their peers' admiration. It was proof of their abilities as mountaineers as well. They had already climbed many of the world's highest peaks, but the treacherous K2 was still missing from their resume. For anyone unaware, K2 is the world's second highest peak and is on the international border between China and Pakistan. You may know that many people have died trying to climb this mountain, and that it is certainly regarded as the most challenging peak in the world. Marty Schmidt had attempted to reach the peak of K2 twice before, in 1992 and in 2000, but both had ended without success. On the other hand, Denali Schmidt was fresh out of college and eager to start his next major ascent. They settled on becoming the first father and son duo to reach the peak of K2. The climbers started getting ready, but had no idea what lay ahead. At the onset of their journey, Marty and Denali Schmidt were joined by another team member, an Australian mountaineer named Chris Warner. Marty and Chris had already climbed Cho Oyu together on different expeditions. They kept in touch, and Chris, a talented and experienced climber, helped organize the trip to K2. Warner was making his second try to climb K2 and meeting Denali for the first time. The journey to K2 base camp was the first step of the adventure. The 3-person crew walked a great distance to get used to the conditions at base camp, the beginning location for most climbers. All seemed well, and Marty and Denali Schmidt began settling in with no apparent problems. They had made it to K2 base camp and were contemplating a climb of the nearby Giant Broad Peak when they changed their minds. There were 2 purposes to this. Initially, they set out for the summit of Giant Broad Peak to aid in the search for 3 missing Iranian mountaineers. The second goal of this expedition was to help the team members acclimate to the high altitude they would have been experiencing on top of K2. Unfortunately, the rescue mission failed, and the Iranian mountaineers were never located. This was like a terrible sign for Marty and Denali Schmidt's trip. After the failed rescue attempt, favorable weather conditions emerged, hinting towards another attempt to reach the summit of K2 on July 28th. The crew led by Marty and Denali Schmidt took advantage of the favorable conditions on July 25th and made the journey to K2's Camp 2. After about lunchtime, they arrived at the campsite. The adventure was going smoothly, with Marty and Denali Schmidt enthusiastic and energetic for the trip ahead. This was a great beginning, and the favorable weather seemed like it would allow them to reach the peak of K2 in a matter of days. The team had only brought enough supplies for a single push, so they only brought 1 camp and enough food for a few days. The adaptation process had been successful, and now the father and son team was prepared for whatever lay ahead. The group made it to Camp 2 on time, so they settled for the night. While they were relaxing and eating, word came that a few Sherpas had been unable to make it to Camp 3 due to the snow. This was discouraging news as the party was shortly moving on to Camp 3. Light snowfall had persisted throughout the afternoon, and reports of upcoming precipitation varied from chest deep to waist deep. As the snowstorm got worse, one of the Sherpas slipped and tumbled down the mountain to his unfortunate demise. This is when a snow avalanche also rained down on the place, so the Sherpas attempted to reach Camp 3 decided to abort their attempt and come back. At Camp 2, every other expedition felt it was too risky to continue the journey in the snow and turned around. Some groups had opted not to attempt the summit, and others had just given up. Yet Marty and Denali Schmidt, with their friend Chris Warner, were determined to press on regardless of the dangers. This was going to turn out to be an extremely bad idea. Due to the persistent snowfall during the night, Chris Warner decided in the morning that he would not be joining the father and son on their walk to Camp 3. Marty and Denali Schmidt understood his reasoning and respected his decision, but they were adamant that continuing the ascent was the wisest course of action. Chris Warner returned to camp while the rest of the team went their separate ways. Upon returning to camp, his first order of business was to await Marty and Schmidt's customary radio transmission. Climbers who had given up were relieved to get a timely call informing them that the father and son team had landed safely at Camp 3. Warner asked what the two had planned for the following day, but they only had time for a brief exchange before Marty and Schmidt stated he would let Warner know during the morning radio call. Little did they know that such radio communication was never going to happen. The father and son were never able to get in touch the following morning, and there was no response to their nightly radio check-in. Warner slept with his radio on, hoping to receive a call, but he was ultimately disappointed to the core when communications couldn't happen. Without word from Marty and Denali Schmidt for an entire day, Warner finally persuaded some Sherpas to check on Camp 3 the following day. The Sherpas made rapid progress up the mountain and made radio contact to share their discovery with Warner and the other climbers. To their absolute surprise, a massive avalanche had destroyed Camp 3. The Sherpas looked everywhere for the father and son, who hoped to make history by becoming the first to reach the summit of K2. The team checked deep and thorough, but their tents were nowhere to be found. The Sherpas eventually only came upon pieces of Marty and Denali Schmidt's gear. As the mountain would be impossible to navigate without the proper equipment, this was not a favorable sign for the climbers. It was July 26th at the time. When Sherpas saw the terrible weather, they hurried back down the mountain. In the following few days, authorities relentlessly searched for Marty and Denali Schmidt, but sadly, Marty Schmidt's daughter, Sequoia D'Angelo, verified their deaths on Twitter on July 29, 2013. It was speculated that the two were sleeping in their tent at the Camp 3 site when the avalanche struck, smothering them to death. Of course, the mountaineering community and their friends and family suffered greatly from their passing. Neither victim's body was recovered from the avalanche, and it appeared unlikely they would ever be located. However, a Swiss climber named Mike Horn later found some remains, whose video he shared online. The climbing community would get outraged if they discovered that Mike Horn had not properly buried the remains. However, it was unclear if the bodies were those of the father and son or one of other climbers who had passed away while attempting to reach the peak of K2. After viewing her parents' bodies, Sequoia D'Angelo made the trek to the K2 base camp to say her final goodbyes. K2 Memorial is where the remains were interred. The remains were initially considered Marty and Denali Schmidt's, but later DNA tests disproved this. So the two are still deep inside K2, and perhaps the mountain has finally embraced them. For similar content, feel free to have a look at some of the other videos on your screen.